Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a story that I think you'll find both fascinating and a little bit unsettling. It's about Nicolás Maduro and how he's managed to hold on to power in Venezuela for over a decade, despite incredible challenges.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher for a lot of people.
It is, and that's what makes it so interesting. We're going to be looking at his tactics, his alliances, and the pretty steep cost of his staying in power. All of this is based on an article from investor Nicolás Maduro that knows was a resilient leader amidst chaos. It came out on December 7th of this year, so it's pretty up to date.
Definitely a timely one.
So get ready for some twists and turns because this story is, well, anything but straightforward.
You can say that again. I mean, just look at how the article starts. A U.S. delegation meeting with Maduro in Caracas, barely a week after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, that was a shocker. I mean, this is after years of the U.S. basically calling him a dictator and hitting his regime with sanctions.
It's almost like the world turned upside down overnight.
Right. So what happened? What made the U.S. suddenly shift gears like that?
Well, one word: oil. The West slapped those sanctions on Russia and suddenly found themselves in a bind. They needed oil, and, Venezuela just happens to have some of the biggest reserves in the world.
Oh, I see. So Maduro saw an opportunity and, well, he seized it.
He definitely knew how to play his cards right. Positioned Venezuela as a potential solution to the whole Russian oil export problem.
Wow, talk about being in the right place at the right time.
For sure.
But to really understand how we got to this point, we need to go back a bit. Before Maduro, there was Hugo Chavez, the leader who started Venezuela's socialist revolution. He used the country's oil money to fund all sorts of social programs, things like housing, healthcare, education. He promised a whole new era of equality.
Yeah, Chavez was a larger-than-life figure. To understand Maduro, you got to understand Chavez first. I mean, Maduro was his chosen successor, his right-hand man.
But when Chavez died in 2013, a lot of folks doubted whether Maduro could actually fill his shoes,
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of skepticism.
especially because his election win was super close. And, well, let's just say not everyone believed it was totally legitimate.
Right.
So he inherits this country that's flush with oil money, but also deeply divided politically. What happens next?
Things start to unravel pretty quickly, actually. Oil prices tank, and Venezuela's economy, which was way too reliant on oil, basically goes into free fall.
Ouch.
And then you add mismanagement and corruption within the government to the mix.
Not a good combination.
Not at all. The article really paints a stark picture of how bad things got for everyday Venezuelans. Hyperinflation wiped out their savings. Basic goods became impossible to find. People were waiting in lines for hours just to get necessities.
It really shows how fragile prosperity can be, especially when a country's relying on just one thing for its wealth. The article mentions that millions of people ended up fleeing the country just trying to find a better life.
It was a mass exodus. And as things got worse, Maduro's government responded by clamping down hard.
Right, protests were breaking out all over the country. Students, workers, opposition figures, everyone was feeling the pain.
Everyone. And instead of listening to their concerns, Maduro basically doubled down on control.
So he cracked down even harder.
Oh, yeah. He sent in state security forces to shut down the protests, and it got really ugly. Over 130 young protesters were killed. And that's when Maduro's image as a ruthless leader, someone who'd do anything to stay in power, really solidified.
It's a dark chapter for sure.
Yeah?
And through all this, Maduro's tightening his grip on the one thing that fueled the crisis in the first place: oil. He nationalized the industry, making sure all the profits went straight to him, concentrating power even more among the ruling elite.
It makes you wonder, was this just about holding on to power, or was there a deeper strategy at play? The article hints that it might be both.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What kind of strategy are we talking about here?
Well, think of it like this. He used the oil money to create a system where he rewarded his supporters and punished anyone who opposed him. Classic political maneuvering.
Ah, so he was playing both sides.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated because he starts looking for allies outside of Venezuela, people who could help him withstand the growing pressure from the international community.
Sounds like he's playing a very dangerous game,
Yeah.
cracking down on dissent at home while trying to make friends abroad.
A high-stakes game for sure.
So did these gambles pay off?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll dig into after a quick word from our sponsors.
We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive into Nicolás Maduro's Venezuela. Don't go anywhere. So before the break, we were talking about Maduro using that oil money to kind of shore up his power and make those alliances outside Venezuela. It sounded like he was walking a pretty thin line, trying to manage this collapsing economy while the world's kind of breathing down his neck.
Oh, it was a tough balancing act for sure. And the article really digs into how that international pressure really shaped his decisions. As things in Venezuela were falling apart, the U.S. under Trump really started turning up the heat.
Oh, yeah, I remember those years.
Crippling sanctions targeting the oil industry, freezing assets. They even went as far as recognizing Juan Guaido, an opposition leader, as the real president of Venezuela.
Wow, so they were really trying to push Maduro out. But wouldn't those sanctions end up hurting the people they were trying to help? You know, the everyday Venezuelans who were already struggling.
It's a tough question. And the article actually tackles that. It wasn't a clear-cut situation. Some people argue those sanctions totally backfired, made the humanitarian crisis even worse, didn't really weaken Maduro's hold on power. Others say the pressure was necessary to try and push for some kind of democratic change. There are no easy answers there.
It makes you think about the unintended consequences, how sometimes trying to fix something can actually make it worse. But through all this, Maduro hangs on. He survives assassination attempts, coup plots those huge protests we talked about. How does he do it? What's the secret to his staying power?
Well, a few things helped him survive. First, he never lost control of the military. That's crucial in any country, especially one that's as unstable as Venezuela. And he was really good at that global power play. Remember those alliances he was building? Those turned out to be essential, especially the one with Russia.
Ah, yeah, Russia. The article makes it clear their support was key for Maduro.
Absolutely. Military aid, economic assistance, and I think this is the big one. They gave him diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. Basically, Russia stepping in throws a wrench in U.S. plans to isolate Venezuela. It becomes this proxy conflict, bigger powers using Venezuela as a chessboard.
And all of this just shows how important oil is on the world stage. It can make for some unlikely partnerships, countries with totally different views working together. But even with these powerful friends, it's obvious that Maduro's staying in power has come at a price. What does the article say about how Venezuela's doing now?
It's not a pretty picture. The country's deeply divided. A small group at the top holding all the wealth and everyone else struggling with poverty, shortages, you name it. The article is pretty blunt about the human cost of Maduro's rule. Human rights abuses, political persecution, corruption's everywhere.
It's tragic. And it's just heartbreaking to think about all those Venezuelans who felt they had no choice but to leave everything behind, to try and make a new life somewhere else. So after 10 years of all this, the economic disaster, the repression, the international pressure, where does Venezuela go from here? What happens next?
The million-dollar question, right? And the article doesn't give us a clear answer. Maduro's shown he's a survivor. He's weathered every storm so far. But Venezuela is still a tinderbox.
So what are the big things that will shape the country's future? What should our listeners be watching for as this story continues?
A few things, I think. First, what happens inside Venezuela? Can Maduro keep the military on his side? Will the opposition get their act together and mount a serious challenge?
And those international connections, those have been so important for him.
Right. How things play out between Venezuela, Russia, China, and the U.S., that's going to be huge. The price of oil, how much pressure the international community puts on Maduro, whether other countries decide to keep supporting him. All of that will make a difference.
It sounds like the future of Venezuela is really hanging in the balance. So many unknowns, so many different ways things could go. But one thing is for sure, this story matters.
Absolutely. It's a story about power and about survival and about the real human cost when things go wrong politically and economically. The stories of everyday Venezuelans just trying to get by, trying to build a future for their families, that's at the heart of this.
Their strength in the face of all this is incredible, but it's also just really sad. It reminds you that behind all the news and analysis, real people's lives are being turned upside down. So as we head into the final part of our look at all of this, we're going to go a bit deeper into those stories. We'll talk about Maduro's legacy, the challenges that Venezuela is facing, and what might be next for them.
We'll also leave you with some questions to think about, because understanding what's happening in Venezuela and why it matters to all of us, that's crucial for anyone who wants to understand the world we live in.
Okay, so we talked about a lot. That unexpected meeting with the U.S., how Venezuela's economy went from boom to bust, and how Maduro's managed to hang on to power, making some pretty powerful friends along the way. But I think it's good to just step back for a second, think about what it all means. Like, what are the big takeaways here? What makes this story so important?
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to get lost in all the details. So what's the big picture?
Well, I think Maduro's story has a few important lessons. One is how relying so heavily on one resource, like oil in Venezuela's case, can be both good and bad. Sure, it can boost the economy, but it also leaves you vulnerable.
Kind of like a double-edged sword, right?
Exactly. I mean, Venezuela used to be the richest country in South America, all thanks to that oil. But then prices crashed and the whole thing just unraveled. And that leads to the second takeaway, I think. How domestic politics, what's happening on the global stage, and all those resources, they're all tangled up.
Yeah.
We saw how Maduro used oil money to solidify his power. He made those alliances with countries like Russia and China. He's a pretty savvy player on the world stage.
He knows how to work the system.
Right. And it just shows you that what happens on the other side of the world can have a real impact. It affects what leaders do, and it affects people's everyday lives.
For sure.
And speaking of everyday people, I think that's the biggest takeaway from all this. It's the human cost when things go wrong politically and when the economy collapses.
You can't forget about those millions of Venezuelans who have suffered under Maduro's rule. They've dealt with poverty, repression. It's their stories. The families struggling to put food on the table, the young people leaving everything behind to try and find a better life. Those are the stories that stay with you.
It's incredible how strong they've been, but it's also just really sad. It reminds you that there are real people behind all the headlines, real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
So as we wrap up here, I have to ask, given everything we've learned about Maduro and all the complexities in Venezuela, do you think his rule will eventually end peacefully? Or are we looking at more conflict down the line?
That's the question everyone wants answered, isn't it?
Mhm.
And I don't know that there is a clear answer right now. Maduro's shown he can survive. He's come through sanctions, protests, and pressure from all over the world. But Venezuela is a very volatile place.
Feels like the story's not over yet.
Not by a long shot.
So what should people be paying attention to as this all continues to play out?
Well, keep an eye on what's happening inside Venezuela. Can Maduro keep the military on his side? Will the opposition be able to unite and actually challenge him?
And what about all those relationships he has with other countries? Those have been pretty important for him, right? Oh, absolutely. How things develop between Venezuela and countries like Russia, China, and the U.S. is going to be critical. What happens with the price of oil, how much pressure the world puts on Maduro if those other countries keep supporting him, all of that will have an impact.
Sounds like there's a lot hanging in the balance.
Mm-hmm.
So much we don't know, so many different ways this could go. But one thing's for sure, this story matters.
Matters a lot. It's about power. It's about survival. It's about what happens to people when things fall apart politically and economically. It's a reminder that we need to pay attention.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive, to look at these stories, these situations, and try to understand them a little better. So to everyone listening, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, because the story of Venezuela, like so many other stories happening in the world, isn't over yet.
It's not even close.
And that's it for us. We'll see you next time for another Deep Dive.